Nick actually isn't a business continuity practitioner as such. His actual background is a qualified accountant. He is a supply chain professional who's held a variety of global financial, supply chain and commercial positions in a number of industry sectors. So he's currently leading the rollout of a number of supply chain risk products for Zurich Insurance, and that's given him the opportunity to interact, of course, with a large number of global companies. So together with co-presenter Lyndon, Technical Director of the BCI, who I'm sure needs no further introduction than that, they're here to present the results of that supply chain resilience survey. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nick Wildgoose. And Lyndon Bird.
Yeah, this is Nick here, for those here. We confuse them, shall we? I'm not going to say a lot. Nick is going to do the main part of the presentation, but just a little bit of background to what this survey is about. 5 years ago, the BCI, together with the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, which Nick is a director of, and Zurich, the international insurance business, we decided that we really ought to do more research into the effect of supply chain interruptions. How frequent were they? What impacts they were having on organizations? And we actually started conducting a survey. And we've continued to do that for 5 years. And after 5 years, of course, it gives you a much bigger base of trends and data to look at. So after 5 years, we felt, well, we will publish a report. There is a report that is available. You can all pick up your copies at the BCI stand afterwards. Nick's got the only copy available, I think. Yeah, okay, that's right. I was told by our people on the stand that they had to go afterwards for some reason. So if you'd like to pick that up. I'll just put in a little bit of context very quickly, if I can get this thing to move forward. Okay, I won't do that. Just the context is, this survey conducted this year was based on responses from 71 countries. I don't need to go through all the countries, obviously, but it's a little bit skewed towards the UK because predominantly the survey was to BCI members and the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply members. And it also is probably roughly in line with the sort of breakdown of the BCI type of membership anyway. So UK, US, Australia, Canada were probably were the largest number of respondents. But we did get quite a lot from other parts of the world. And there was no one sector. It was, again, as you would expect, the largest response was from the sort of finance and insurance sector, but that was less than 30%. So, the other 70% was pretty well spread across all sorts of other sectors. So it's a pretty broad spread of figures we've got from this. So, what I'll do then is hand over to Nick. I'll just have a few words when Nick's finished to say a few business continuity messages out of it, but I'll hand over now to Nick to go through the main parts of the survey.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Lyndon. Right, I'd firstly like to congratulate you all for coming to this session, because for those of you here this morning with Paul, he mentioned that in the recent CEO survey that PwC do every year, the only thing that vaguely resembled business continuity in terms of their CEO's priorities was at number 4 on the charts, supply chain disruption. So I just wonder whether this is the key to the door for you to progress other business continuity matters. I think it might be. My first question to you as well is, how many of you have read or seen last year's survey? Could I have a show of hands, please? That's pretty good. We're winning the Ashes battle. When I was down in Australia, I was saying to Lyndon, I'd met a few of the BCI members down there last week, and none of them have read it, I'm afraid. I don't know whether they have a different website or different communication, so they lost that Ashes battle. Okay, I'll get into kind of the hit parade of the results now. So, again, to keep it interactive at this time in the afternoon, how much do you think is the level of disruptions experienced by companies who responded to the survey this year? What percentage? Anybody want to guess? In excess of 50, do we think? Lower, higher? So I do need to get you warmed up, don't I, this afternoon? Any guesses? So do you want to have a guess? No, it's higher than that. Henry at the back there, I know you're trying to hide. What do you think? What? 60. Yeah, it's in fact higher than both of those figures. It's still at 75%, which is marginally up on last year. For Lyndon and I, clearly this is quite disappointing in the sense of we'd like to think it would be going down. And let's face it, if it was just 20%, it'd be significant. I'm not saying that, whether it's 75 or 73 as it was last year, that's a significant change. But it's quite frightening in one way, isn't it? And then the other thing I'd like to pick out from this kind of headline figure is the 3% that have more than, basically one disruption a week of some significance. And, they're obviously adrenaline junkies, aren't they? They like this type of stuff. And if you're in the business continuity profession, perhaps you could sit by them all the time and have great fun, if that's what you like doing. You could really test out your plans there, couldn't you, as we talked about earlier? Okay, so that's the kind of headline figure. Please, by the way, as we go through, if you've got any questions, ask me them as we go along. And then the next thing is, what is the cause of disruption? And again, the top of the hit parade this year is IT failure. And you'll see that also cyber attack is rising up. So that, I like to think of supply chains at kind of 4 levels, if this is helpful. There's a physical flow of goods that goes through, and lots of people focus on that, but then there's the information flow. And clearly that's being hit quite dramatically. And then the financial flow, and then the people aspect of the supply chain. We talked a lot about people and behavior in this group earlier. So IT is there, and that's a key one, I think, to say, because so many companies focus on the physical causes of failure and don't think about the information flows. So that's up there on the top level. And I'll leave you to kind of digest the rest unless you've got any specific questions. And then this is just another slide. I don't think I'll go through this in any great detail, but 55% of those who recorded IT said it had a significant high or some impact. So pretty significant there. And we'll come on later to the kind of financial values involved. This is another thing I always highlight. And many of you are aware of this from the previous report? Because how many of you talk regularly to your supply chain teams? Can I have a show of hands? That's not bad. That's improvement on where it used to be. I think you'll agree with me that most of them tend to focus on the tier 1 suppliers still. A few enlightened companies are changing and looking for their strategic suppliers all the way down the tiers. I'm delighted to see that. I met, on the positive side down in Australia last week, I met one company that had actively got their CEO involved. And I'll come on to that in that story in the relationship side. But given if you focus on your tier 1 suppliers, this is saying you'll be about 60% right. Because 42% of the disruptions aren't happening there at all. They're happening further down the supply chain. So that reinforces our message, if you're wondering what you do about this. For critical supply chains, your companies or organizations shouldn't be just settling for checking out the tier 1 supplier. They should be going to tier 2 and below. And I can tell you many stories. For example, back in 2010, we were doing some work with a company, and we checked out the financials of the tier 2 suppliers and found 2 of them were just about to go out of business. So we rung that client up and said, you might want to think about what your contingency plan is to do with their most profitable product about the tier 2 failure. So something I think to take back to the office and think about. Just by industry sector, again, I think I'll go over this quite quickly. As you might expect, I think in summary, because I know it'd be difficult to read at the back, the IT failure is mainly coming through in the service, the financial services type of areas as having the most significant impact. In manufacturing, it tends to be more around the physical transport link, although IT is still quite a significant issue in there. Now the impacts. So the overall impacts. The kind of scary thing here is the top line number. So we've got 15% that are greater than €1 million. But if you look at one of them there, this one here, 250 million to 500 million range. That's a range we put in there. But let's say it's even at the bottom end of that range. So that company has had that kind of impact just in this last year. And I personally think most companies underestimate, even when they put these figures in, because I can't believe they go out and work out how much of the time it takes as a CFO, the operations director, even yourselves perhaps, to manage a supplier when they get into problems. And finding another supplier perhaps, or sort all that out. I don't think that gets fully costed in. But this is a significant figure. I remember last year, there was a company over 100 million, and BCI, I got them to ring up because I thought this seems extraordinary. This is from one incident. But they rung up the relevant company and they confirmed that was it. I mean, perhaps I shouldn't be too surprised, by the way, because when I go out and talk to companies, one of the first things we do is look at the financial impact of a key supplier failing. And I know we found quite a number where just one supplier failing can lead to a business interruption that's in excess of 100 million euros. So this is, again, the single impact. And you can see that 250 million looks like it was from one event. So, a massive number to most of the organisations in here. I appreciate some of the big oil companies, that's probably just a small blip, but to most of us that's significant. And even if we take the lower end of the disruptions, surely if you've got a lot of disruptions costing between 1 and 10 million euro, you'd think about becoming more proactive. And you could spend some time on proper business continuity plans, which we'll come on to for the suppliers. I'm sure that's the bit you're really excited about, is when Lyndon comes on and starts talking business continuity to you. Okay, moving on, what is actually, the full cost of this? What's the impact? So loss of productivity is number one there. Customer complaints is something that's rising up through the field. I think that can be very important to you when you look at, we'll come on to outsourcing supplier failure as one of the key issues. Certainly for us, those of us in financial services and so on, we outsource a lot of our customer support. It's critical that we get that right. You can see share price value fall is there as well. And by the way, on share price impact of these disruptions, we heard a lot of figures this morning. There is a lot of research around supply chain disruptions. And the range of disruption cost of these, we heard 9% mentioned, I think earlier, is typically between 9 and 30% of a supply chain disruption based on US quoted companies. And some extensive research has been done by PwC again and some leading academics. So it's important that you get the focus on this. So, and this is not good, is it? Let's face it, as a score on the business continuity side. So for key suppliers, this is all we ask them to focus on, because we don't expect them to have, companies to have business continuity plans for all their suppliers, but just the key suppliers. Half of them are stating that they've not covered half their suppliers in that sense, and less than 10%, 11%, only 10% basically have said they've covered all their strategic suppliers. It'd be nice if we saw that figure climbing, but it isn't climbing dramatically. Lyndon and I will vouch over the 5 years, unfortunately. And Lyndon and I want to retire in peace and tranquility and not have to worry about this, so can you step up in the next year? Right. In terms of issues of concern, customer priority, not even knowing who your key suppliers are, we've still got 30% of the people there. As I said, just one of the exercises I would do if you get back to the office, if you don't know this, do you all know who your key suppliers are? Have you talked to your supply chain team? Can I have a show of hands again? That's good. But there's still a few people who haven't got their hands up. Why not? I mean, it's a relatively simple exercise to do, at least to come to initial priorities. Then we can get into all kinds of impacts of reputation, but just from a profit point of view, let's just look at those. Cost of disruption. Another thing, wouldn't you think if you're going to improve, and most of us are on a kind of continuous improvement, lean type of approach, you'd capture what the costs of supply chain disruptions are. I think we came up with it in terms of the models earlier. And yet, here we are, 75% of companies are saying they don't capture this. And 36% aren't recording it at all, what the cost of these disruptions are. So how are you going to make improvements if you don't record it? And then perhaps this is an interesting contrast actually with the PwC report from this survey, because clearly there seems to be a disconnect, or maybe it's just this is perfectly correct in the sense of, I think the PwC report said around 30-ish% of CEOs had supply chain disruptions as a top concern, and yet 62% feel that top management here, this is the BCI community, the supply chain community, don't feel that the CEO is engaged. And that certainly is the trick, I have to say. As I say, with this Australian company, it was a revelation. They weren't all like this, but I've been to a big mining company, had 12 people in the room, business continuity, supply chain, finance people, and they really got it. And the part of the trick was their CEO was on board. So he was playing an active role of getting to know the critical suppliers personally at CEO level, because he knew when they got an issue, maybe them and their competitors would have an issue, he wanted to make sure when he made the call to Steve or Bill or whoever it was, that they would know him and they might well respond. I mean, it's a very basic thing to do, but really all of your CEOs should be in that position as well. And there's lots of old stories. I won't go over the old story, but in a sense, the Nokia Ericsson story is a basis of relationship, although it was a last-minute one there, but that's how they leveraged the situation at the time. Customer tender, I'm slightly surprised at this figure, because I thought this is basically saying how many, in customer tenders looking the other way, how many of people are asking for business continuity plans of you. And it seems to have gone down, which again is disappointing. Because I'd like to think it's coming up, because we can drive an activity in the supply chain by asking for these, business continuity plans to encourage the whole exercise. And I think as a profession, the Business Continuity Institute and bodies should be looking at some of this, and we'll need to track it in the future. Future risks. This is your predictions. I mean, I think if I may comment on this, I'd add one other thing that I think is going to make the situation perhaps worse than it is at the moment as the economy picks up. And I don't think it's reflected in here from all the people, the supply chain people and BCI people who responded. And that's capacity constraints. I think it's been mentioned much today, but certainly in a lot of the manufacturing industry at the moment, as demand is picking up, in the recession, lots of capacity was taken out to the extent of closing factories in the automotive industry. That can't be suddenly turned on. You can't suddenly just have a factory there to build new engines. It takes 12, 24 months. So I predict there's going to be, any little issue you get in the supply chain, with a factory burning down or closing down or a strike or whatever it might be, or a failure, is going to be exaggerated because there just isn't the capacity out there anywhere, because of what happened in the last 5 years. So just an observation. But here you can see, inconsistently with what we've seen, it's technology is one of the key issues you see both in the short and the long-term horizon. I would agree with that. We've had quite a lot of talk about social media, haven't we, today, and what an impact that can have. But certainly without IT, so many of our information systems fail. And the latest thing I've heard about, probably you have as well or read, is now people are hacking into some of the navigation ships, shipping, the marine cargo ships are going round, and so they can create bogus ships and give you wrong directions of where they are, which is quite interesting, because apparently there's no security over ships' navigation computers, so that's the big challenge. Now for the exciting bit, for Lyndon talking about business continuity planning.
Obviously, from our point of view, from the BCI's point of view, one of the things that we were interested in when we started this really was the involvement of the business continuity practitioner. in this whole process, because we felt that perhaps, certainly 5 years ago, there were supply chain professionals, there were procurement professionals, there were contract professionals, and they probably never spoke to business continuity people, or business continuity people didn't necessarily see supply chain as something that was in their remit, or if they did, they didn't necessarily have the authority in their organizations to convince people that was part of their remit. So we did ask and have asked a number of questions. I'll just run through one or two of the points, but what I thought was interesting, there are a few more when you read the report, there are a few more conclusions, but this 20% is just coincidence, it's 20 in both of these graphs, but essentially, according to this survey, 20% of the people we surveyed who are business continuity professionals or supply chain professionals would say that they don't include supply chain disruptions in their own internal programs. So they don't actually, in developing business continuity programs, consider supply chain disruption at all, which is quite high at 20%, seeing that's such a significant number of disruptions, as we've demonstrated from the rest of the survey. And by coincidence, the other 20% is really a separate question, but the other 20% don't ask their suppliers anything at all about their business continuity either. So there is, in at least a fifth of all organizations, a complete lack of understanding or transparency about what the issues with supply chain is. 20% don't collect BC information, so that's the 20% that don't ask at all their suppliers. Some of them, of course, do. That means 80% do have some communication with their key suppliers. This makes one very big assumption. When I talk through any of these slides, I talk about suppliers. I actually do mean key suppliers. And as Nick's made the point, do you necessarily know who your key suppliers are, and what basis have you determined those key suppliers? So that's another question. This almost is making the assumption that we are talking about key suppliers, because obviously if you're a large organization, you may have 100,000 suppliers of everything from paper clips to whatever, and you're not going to be interested in checking business continuity to everybody who supplies you anything. But we're talking really genuine key suppliers. So even amongst those, 20% of organizations said they don't collect any information. And then those that do have different ways of collecting it. And the most popular is we give them a self-assessment questionnaire to fill in, which may have value. It has some consistency in format that they fill in, but it isn't actually going to, in my view, tell them an awful lot of real value about that. We require copies of documentation. Some have gone to, we audit them. Some have even gone to request an independent audit. But it's still concerning that 20% don't collect any information at all. So clearly the supplier information that is collected will vary with the criticality of the supplier. And these are just some of the things we asked people, did they do this? And again, it's a pretty mixed bag. We have 43% who say we check whether they have a BCM program rather than just a plan, which is fine if they've properly defined what we mean by the difference. There are quite a lot who say they look for compliance with good practice, such as our own good practice guidelines or BS 25999 Part 1. What surprised me in this, and I think is probably just a bit of a reflection on the survey, is if you go down to, we look for certification to a recognized standard, where 33% said that, which clearly is going to be very high when you talk about certification, although our friends from the certification bodies may well wish that were the case, but it probably is going to take a long time till that is the case. I think we look for alignment to a standard, i.e. the principles of the standard and doing it in line with the standard. At 39% does seem a more reasonable figure. We only asked for the presence of a business continuity plan, 31%. Not really, again, very helpful. If the question is, have you got a business continuity plan? Yes, that's the end of that one. I don't know quite what value you'd expect to get from that. And very few people, and this is disappointment to us, but quite understandable, very few people are interested in the credentials of those who put that business continuity management program in for their suppliers, which is interesting, because I would have thought in most walks of life you'd be concerned about the quality of it, and you therefore be concerned about who is doing it. So if I went to have an operation, I'd assume, I'd hope that the doctor could prove that he was got the right qualification for doing the operation. But it does seem that no one really checks on the qualification or capabilities of the people doing it. So that's an opportunity area for the BCI, of course, but it's interesting. Okay, these are, how do people validate supplier plans? And a lot of them people do, but still 49%, so almost half, say they don't really attempt to validate the plans that the suppliers have got. So these are the ones who've identified critical suppliers and communicate with them and asked about their plans. And they may have looked at them in the ways I talked about in the previous slide, but when you come to validate it, have you got any real proof that they would work in any situation? Then 49% of those really don't. Some of the ways they go about doing it, for those that do, we look at the outcome reports following tests or exercises. Some of them go to the point of joint exercises with key suppliers based on scenarios. Some observe the suppliers' exercises. Some have run desktops jointly. Some have run joint workshops. Some of them have actually effectively agreed the pre-test scope of the suppliers and signed off the results. So they've treated it a bit like their own audit of their own programs. So lots of different ways people would answer that. It doesn't seem to be any single set approach that people take, but again, sadly, 50% say they don't really make any attempt to prove or demonstrate that those plans that they've been told exist have really been properly tested. Reviewing plans, again, similar sort of question. How do the plans are reviewed, and when are the plans reviewed? Again, what we see here is that what we think this is rather a passive approach. Lots of people say where business continuity is part of their contract negotiation process, it tends to only be at the contract negotiation point. Some people would say, well, we'll review the business continuity arrangement next time we renegotiate the contract, and that's the biggest scorer there. Some say they never do it once, they just check it once at the beginning, and then they never do any further reviewing after that. Some have scheduled meetings, some pretty much ad hoc. So again, no sort of commonality of standard of the approach, but it tends to be the most popular is just when you have to renew a contract. And of course, it depends how long that contract is being enforced, but many things on both sides of the supplier and your own organisation could have changed dramatically in that period of time. And those are really some of the key things that I picked out from a sort of business continuity practitioner's standpoint. So I'd now hand back to Nick to talk a little bit of the trends we've seen over the last 5 years and some final thoughts. Okay.
Right, so just to comment a little on, for those avid readers of this report, and I hope you've all been that, over the 5 years, the figures never dropped below 70% actually, of disruptions. And in 2011 with the tsunami and the Thailand floods, it went to 85%, which is perhaps not that surprising. At least it's showing, some time with external events. And I have to say that was the year that I think Lyndon and I thought, well, we got some traction. We didn't have to put the scary pictures up or illustrate this with unique examples because so many different industries were badly affected by that. to the tune of billions. And if you don't believe me, just look at some of the Japanese results around the time after the tsunami, and even the Thai floods as well, their quarterly results, and see what happened to the share price, and more particularly the costs on their balance sheet at the time. And just to pick another example, how many of you have heard about Evonik in the group? Have a show of hands? I'll tell you that little story. So that was only last year, where one part of a chemical plant in Germany, Evonik's plant in Germany, so not the whole site even, blew up. It made brake resin for most of the car manufacturers. They thought it was for 20% of their production globally, but they actually hadn't worked out, going back to think about your tiered suppliers, they were actually a sub-supplier to one of the other suppliers with the brake resin. So actually it was around 40% of car production worldwide could have depended on this plant. They then spent the next 8 weeks desperately recertifying at some cost, all getting together so they could get cars out of the production lines and to work together. So, you know, and I think there's a danger that we're creating more and more single points of failure. So I'm sure you've all seen this quote before. I hope in this room we haven't got insanity setting in. Maybe it's just Lyndon and I at the front here. But if we're not changing our approach to supply chain risk management, and you can be the catalyst to get your supply chain people to think about this, for those who aren't. And if it reassures you, by the way, the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply has as one of their top priorities that their professionals should be looking at risk. The challenge they've got sometimes is that the CEOs sometimes of their businesses are saying it's all about cost reduction since 2008. So they do need perhaps some help from you guys to say, well, you know, disruptions are a medium-term cost. They're happening to us. We just need to highlight those and bring them in, because they're often buried in variances. So I hope this is encouraging you to do something when you get back to the office. We talked about the methodology and the recording, I think. I'm slightly concerned, but I don't think it's a trend yet, that the Tier 2 issue has actually gone up a couple of %. I don't think that's yet significant, but I think we need to watch that going forward. We only came up with that question jointly 3 years ago, so we've got 3 years of trail. It's consistently been just below 40%, just stepping up to 42%. And we found that also with some other work we did, research work. So it's validated really at 40%, which is quite significant. I think I've already pointed out that it's a key issue. Working with your professional procurement team can be key. Lyndon's brought out the point, and I agree with him, and I have to say I was guilty as a supply chain director, so I was really smart. I put in business continuity clauses into my contracts and insisted on seeing the business continuity plan, even though it wasn't one of my key objectives, because that was cost saving. But then what did I do with them? At the best, I might have looked at them. I certainly never had time to go back and test them out or whatever, even on the critical suppliers. That's probably changed since my time 5, 6 years ago in certain companies. But I think we've got some way to go, judging by the survey results. And I think you as a profession have a key role to play in pushing that through. And it's a journey, by the way. We're not going to solve this, you know, in one day. But in the coming years, I'd like to see improvements. And that's my final message, really. I know we talked a lot about crisis management, but I'd rather see us being proactive and start to tackle some of these issues before they arise, because I believe that's a cheaper, probably more cost-effective way of doing it. And why wouldn't you do it when it's number 4 on your CEO's priority list, or many of you? You might get a meeting with him or one of his sidekicks and use that as a lever, you know, a kind of Trojan horse to get business continuity management more solidly embedded in your organizations. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. Welcome any questions.
Okay, so just before we move on to our next session, we've got a couple of minutes if we want to take them. Questions, observations, comments from the floor, please. Startlingly good-looking young man in the middle.
But for now, you'll just have to vote with me.
Okay.
Just a question for both of you, really. How statistically valid do you believe that your review actually is? So you're basing a lot of you put in a lot of thought into the details that you've got. you're extrapolating that information, but how valid is the base data, do you feel?
Well, the survey, clearly, like any of these type of surveys, is not fully representative, because clearly the people that are going to answer it are the people that have some interest in the subject. So people that haven't, don't even see any interest in the subject at all are probably not going to answer the survey. So I mean, there's that proviso. All that I can say is it's across our membership, and it's across some of SIP's membership, which is, as I said, it's spread across countries and it's spread across sectors, and it's spread across knowledge base as well. It's not just business continuity managers, it's some procurement managers and some insurance people as well. So it's, I think it's fine for what it is. Clearly, you can't extrapolate it across the world and come up and say, this is a definitive statistical survey, but it's probably as good as anything else in the world. And the one type of business that's pretty good at probability and risk and numbers and things are valued in the insurance world, and it's supported by them. So hopefully it's reasonably.
Yeah, I think Lyndon's put some valid caveats on it in terms of who responds, but we've had now over 500 respondents every year, which is quite a substantial. It's not just 20 companies, which you see in some of these surveys that get pushed out and said it's gospel. I think we've done a valuable service for the the whole of industry. The BCI has in leading this, because there was nothing like it when the BCI approached me, frankly, 5 years ago about doing this survey. And in terms of validity as well, I would say we also did a telephone survey. This was purely in the UK, but going out and proactively, so that we just went down used a call centre and so on for another piece of work for mid-sized UK manufacturing companies. And the consistency we got out, a totally different survey approach. We still got the figure of over 70% again. We still got the second tier at 40%. So, this is a widely quoted figure. The academics see this, and none of them have jumped up and down and said this is, invalid or we can't use it. It's widely quoted. So,
that's great. For those kind of numbers, I feel a lot happier. So, thank you.
Okay, and you've got the detail of the numbers and the split in the survey. And you're quite right. Some of the questions are less well answered, so they're the ones we have to be careful about. But it's the numbers are in there for you, or we can give you those.
It's just before I use it as a stick to poke senior managers. I'd just like to know the facts. Thanks.
Absolutely, no problem.
Julian, behind you, please. Thank you.
Sorry, me again. Just wondering if the extensive surveys over the years have resulted in some really realistic best practice that can be pushed out. So I know different organisations will approach looking for how different elements of supply chain can be delivered, but is there an ideal sort of, for example, routine or frequency in which you ask your suppliers to provide confirmation of their business continuity arrangements, just as an example?
So maybe I'll comment on the broader best practice, and there's certainly best practice was dangerous thing. Is it better practice or improved practice? I think we're all on a journey to improve it, and then I'll hand across to Lyndon specifically on BCM, if that's all right. So generally, of course, there are some basic improvements. I can't cover them all in kind of 2 minutes, but one of the things is to say, some of you don't even know who your top suppliers are, and I think taking a profit or revenue view of that is the first thing, and to avoid the danger with some of your procurement people, I warn you, when you go in to see them and you say, well, who are our top suppliers? They will produce a spend report, and that clearly that's the way they view things. Yeah, but that is clearly the wrong lens to use for what we're talking about from a BI point of view. So that's the first thing I'd say, is understand who your top suppliers are. Then there's some basic things you can do against some of these risks. For example, the physical risk. Again, I think you'll find, do you actually know the locations of your key suppliers, the physical locations in any detail? Have you even checked out? I mean, for example, the flood risk in Europe is growing. We've had significant floods earlier this year. Do you even know where these supplier sites are? These, you know, if you're critical suppliers. So we're probably only, you start a journey, you might just do the top 5 to start with and start to peel that back. And I say the final point before I hand across to Lyndon as a key priority is for those critical supply chains, start to try and peel back and understand who are the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. In the automotive industry, some of the best players there make sure they know now who are their, what they call their touch point suppliers, so some key suppliers, even if they're not a tier 1, because a lot of now in the automotive industry, the fabrication is done for a Ford or a Toyota anyway by a fabricator. They need to go, you know, an assembler really probably is a better word. They need to understand what's below that, where their key pinch points are. And I think you should be in the same position. I now hand across to Lyndon from BCM.
Very quickly. The answer really is that if you look at our GPG 2013, and we've got a lot more in it this time on both outsourced operations and on supply chain than we had before. Not vast amounts, not mandated best practice in quite the way that you define it, but getting more into this field. I'm sure that as we develop future GPGs and appendices and special sections to the GPGs, which we're planning to do next year, we'll try to put more of that in there. But we do have to be careful that we keep it to the continuity aspects rather than trying to set standards for the procurement industry. So we do have to be a bit careful on that.
Thank you, Lyndon. Well, that I'm afraid will have to be the end of that session because we're out of time for you guys. But thank you very much. And guys, would you care to show your appreciation for Lyndon and Nick? Thank you. So our final session of the day is going to be co-presented by David Hawkins, and you might have noticed yet another new presenter at our table. So David, you're no longer the new boy. That's now Adrian's prerogative. Welcome. So I'll just give you a quick introduction to David and Adrian. So they are going to present today jointly, and David's background essentially is in a very, very interesting area that I certainly hadn't come across before. His career has been in projects and procurement within the construction industry, where he has been an active promoter of collaborative concepts. He's the architect of the CRAFT programme and was the technical author of the British Standard Institute's PAS 11000 Collaborative Business Relationship Standard, which was first published in 2006, and the chairman of the BSI committee that developed BS 11000, published in October 2010. And in 2009, he was recognised as one of the top 100 thought leaders on CSR. Adrian Miller is a supply chain professional with over 25 years' experience in the defence and air traffic control sectors, where he's managed supplier relationships and developed and implemented best practice, including multi-million-pound new Prestwick Air Traffic Control Centre. And my cameraman's having a running around at the back there, so I don't know why. And he led the NATS team that achieved BS 11000 certification. So congratulations on that. So today they're going to talk about supply chain vulnerability, resilience versus interdependence. So ladies and gentlemen, do please welcome David and Adrian.
Thank you. Oh, got a little buzzer. Good. So the good thing about being last on is that you get the last word, which is a position my wife thinks I usually like to have anyway. The downside is that by this time in the afternoon, you guys are waning, energy levels are dropping. But if you can hold on for a few more minutes, hopefully we can put some meat on the bones around this area of collaboration. Relationships for me are the cornerstone of business and the biggest risk. However, I defy any of you to find a book on risk management that even references relationship management. Last time I tried, I got a book down off the shelf in Waterstones. It almost gave me a hernia, and I spent 4 hours looking through it and couldn't find one reference. Collaboration is all the buzz. Government, industry, even mentioned at this year's Davos Forum, concluding that governments and industry have to collaborate to solve our economic challenges. Collaboration is the answer, but what was the question? What does it mean in reality, and where does it apply? 50 to 80% of your operational spend is most likely in its supply chain. And yet, as you've just seen from those reports, focus on the supply chain as a 40-year procurement professional is damn hard to get up to the boardroom level to get anybody to pay attention. Global sourcing programs have increased exponentially. These extended networks bridge the traditional boundaries between organisations and introduce a spectrum of risks and business continuity and reputations. Reliance on these extended relationships raises the prospect that resilience and business continuity is no longer an internal issue. A comment, an observation I made earlier today, which was that everything I've heard so far is navel-gazing, looking at your own organisation. You're now extremely exposed. Not literally, I spoke, because otherwise I'd get arrested. So continuity is a consideration for greater awareness, increased focus on collaborative working with third parties to jointly perform. You can't have business continuity if your supply chain isn't running with you. Whoops, there we go. So for those of you who have not heard of the Institute, which won't surprise me at all, hopefully over the next few minutes we can give a little bit of background and talk about what we've been up to and BS 11,000, which again, many of you may not have heard of. The driver for the Institute is that relationships are a crucial aspect of good business, and our aim is to make good practice best practice. We see collaborative skills as a fundamental business discipline. Our perspective is that by linking value chains, organisations are able to harness capabilities across organisational boundaries. To drive this concept, it's not just about people's behaviour. You need processes to underpin the ambitions and hopefully remove internal constraints to make these propositions sustainable. The changing face of business. The world is changing perhaps faster than many of us could imagine. Certainly at my age, it's getting mind-blowing. ICW Research produced something back in 2005 called Future Connections, which was a look at 2020, which outlined the fact that by 2020, most organisations would not be monolithic great conglomerates, they would be networks. Yet the focus was on behavioural models, not skills or governance. We have come a long way from the Industrial Revolution. However, much of the organisational thinking we have is still based in where Henry Ford started. The global marketplace. We see today a marketplace where success is more about what we bring to the market rather than simply what we produce as individual organisations. The need for organisations to work together has perhaps never been more critical in today's economic environment. To meet the demands of the market, growing global competition, the impact of technology and communications, providing the kind of transparency that was talked about earlier on. In the 1980s, we talked about the global village. Today, it's a global marketplace. Globalisation is a fact of life for organisations, full of opportunities, but rife with risk and challenges. Managing these extended supply chains is not for the faint-hearted. In terms of performance, reputation, liabilities, quality, safety, sustainability, one word emerges: interdependence. We no longer work on our own, we work within networks of organisations. A while back I came up with something called the outside-in theory. I was puzzled why organisations wouldn't take relationships seriously. What I discovered, of course, was that we had a business model that was largely based on buying things in, processing them and selling them out. Progressively, we moved to bring in contractors to help us in-house. We then started to outsource, and now we live within a virtual boundary where the kind of issues that I started with back in the 60s in procurement, where it was nice and easy, price, quality, delivery. If you've got 2 out of 3, you're doing quite well. Now we're into total integrated interdependence, CSR, trust, ethos, cultures, all sorts of things. The bigger the corporate profile, the higher the risk of a backlash when, for example, earlier this year, Rana Plaza is just one case in point. Can anybody remember the name of the guy that owned the building? Can anybody remember the name of the companies that were in that building? But I bet you can pick at least 2 of the high street names that were buying from that building. And yet, who looked at what was going on? How close were those organisations integrated? We need alternative thinking. I spent years in a world of, what do you call it, animosity, where we spent lots of time fighting each other, pulling against each other to avoid making decisions or trying to pass those decisions over. As a result, we never got to eat the carrots. If we could actually sit down and have a sensible grown-up discussion about how to do it, what to do, when to do it, how to optimise resources, integrate processes for mutual benefit, we could eventually get round to eating both piles of carrots. The problem is, we don't trust each other. The relationship iceberg. We've talked a lot today about processes. Organisations are really good at processes. Policies, tools, measures, skills, rules, systems, management structures. That's the formal bit. The informal bit, which sits below the waterline, is about people. It's about how do they perform, how do we dictate their behaviours, how do our incentives and the incentives of the organisations, the pressures that we put on them, drive the behaviours that we want. Organisations are really good at this, and certainly in my experience, most of what I got done hadn't anything to do with the processes. It was the people that I dealt with that made things happen. We tend to rely on technology today. But I'll pose the question, when Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, he had to wait 18 months for somebody to ring because there was nobody at the other end of the line. So technology is only one part of the equation. Collaboration needs clear leadership. If we incentivise people the wrong way, we get the wrong results. But our leaders drive us, as we've just heard, about procurement. Why are they not interested in business continuity? Because they're being challenged to reduce costs. In their quest to reduce costs, they're laying landmines all over their organisations. Osmosis and process was another concept that I came up with. Organisational influences dictate how we behave, but our internal influences, the informal stuff, is what actually makes us do the things we want to do. Historically, when we've had a problem of relationships, we did one of 2 things. We either went into process re-engineering, so we adapted the processes we had, or we sent everybody off on a team building exercise. Anybody been on a team building exercise? Spent the weekend? Great, 2 planks and a yogurt pot. You know, fight your way across a field, which is great until you get back to work on Monday morning and the systems implode on you. So it's back to business as usual. We have to foster the right behaviours by creating an environment for it. It's been mentioned already today, behaviours and competencies. What do we look for in our managers of tomorrow? What kind of skills are we looking for to manage these complex relationships which are no longer just simply arm's length contracts? Conventional business skills need to be expanded. BS 11000, to my knowledge, is the first standard ever to come out of BSI that talks about culture and behaviours. Now there's a step forward. We've actually got something on the table which starts to get us focused on the things we need to do. Collaboration versus contracting. I heard a lot about key suppliers, and I share the view. Every time you ask a procurement guy what's his top priority, it's his biggest spend. It's probably his lowest risk, because it is the biggest spend. Everybody's got their focus on it. I saw a major defence contractor have to ground almost all of its missiles because one fabricator went out of business when nobody was looking. And they had to go and buy the company in the end to keep them afloat. So, collaboration at every level works. Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, keep going. Go to Marks and Spencer and see how long that supply chain is to get a pair of underpants made. They stretch all over Europe and Africa and everywhere else. So collaboration is in simple terms, is building sustainable relationships that deliver value for money, better performance, and increased competitiveness. My version is more basic. Collaboration is about grown-up people having grown-up discussions without paying lawyers lots of money. Any lawyers in the room? That's good. I quite like lawyers, I just couldn't eat a whole one. At this point, you know, I do have this problem that we spend our time, and I heard some comments there about putting BCI requirements into tenders, making it contractually responsible. A lot of bloody good if you don't do anything about it. And in any case, most of our contracts are designed to contract for failure. We don't design contracts to be successful, we design them to hold people's feet to the fire after it's gone wrong. That's where we're getting it all screwed up. So maybe we need to think differently. I'll give you a challenge as when you go back to your companies. Go to your supply chain boss, get a copy of your company's standard terms and conditions, take a yellow highlighter and go through them and see if you can find any clause in there which is proactive. The chances are you won't. Just a little aside, I recently went to a seminar on some document management system, quite complex, don't really understand it. You know, technology for me is sort of over there. If somebody invents a fountain pen with a spell checker on it, I'll be really happy. However, they analysed an MOD contract, partnering contract. So they typed into this thing, cooperation and innovation. And out of this vast document got something like 250 hits. They then typed in breach and default and got 7,500 hits. These are the words that were in the contract that was headed up partnering. At that point, as a frequent flyer, just to put some reality into this, I'm going to ask my colleague here, Adrian. As a frequent flyer, I worry about what goes on in aeroplanes and what their supply chain looks like. So, Adrian.
Afternoon. So Dave's talked a lot about theory, really. I'm going to talk to you a bit about how it works in practice. So you probably got from my introduction, NATS is the National Air Traffic Control Provider. So business continuity is crucial for us because we are the UK's leading provider of air traffic solutions. We ensure orderly, efficient and safe passage of all of our flights. We've not had a safety incident in our history that's led to any fatalities. We're very proud of that and we intend to obviously maintain that. And we're handling 2.2 million flights every year. The figures do fluctuate a bit due to economic factors, but it's pretty consistent. And those services are provided worldwide now. Since 2001, when we were part privatised, we've been selling services in other parts of the world. We run towers in Spain. We also sell consultancy and safety advice to up to about 36 other operators. So we're a 24 hour a day, 365 days a year operation. Heathrow is the busiest dual runway airport in the world. Gatwick is the busiest single runway airport in the world. They can only do that because of the service we provide. So, crucial to us, crucial to our customers that we keep our operations running. And the way we feel we do that is ensuring that we have strong relationships with our supply chain. That's why we're certified to BS 11000, because that gives us a framework and a language that we can use with our suppliers. The way we get the benefit of this collaboration is through risk management, sharing the risk challenges with our suppliers and seeing how we can ensure we get the most efficient way of dealing with that. So we're quite happy to have integrated teams working on systems. Our relationships with a number of our collaborative partners are all about taking cost out through not duplicating resources. So we are happy to use their engineers in our operations and ensure that it's not just around, so this challenge of, well, it must cost more, well, actually, the purpose of the collaboration is also to look at how you can do things more efficiently. Now, so these partners must ensure that they display the right behaviours. And obviously that's a lot about trust, openness, going the extra mile, ensuring that we can create the sort of relationship where we don't feel that we're being disadvantaged through, in effect, allowing them much more into our world. And I would say not every other organisation can do this. But interestingly, what we find is, again, BS 11000 gives you that language and that commitment. So it's not an accident that many of our suppliers are also accredited to BS 11000. So one of our key relationships is with Lockheed Martin, who are obviously a global defence company. They do venture into air traffic control. It's quite a small part of their business. But actually, the relationship we have with them is quite significant. And our CEOs do talk. And our CEO does have a route in to the top at Lockheed Martin. So if there are problems, we can pull the right strings. And so that has worked to very good effect. And the point is, Lockheed are a high-performing supplier, critical technology, and they, for us, they've always delivered. That enables us to talk about them in forums like this and actually quite confidently say just how good they are. And so you go beyond a kind of a contractual relationship where you're into a mutually beneficial relationship, and that helps them. They see the benefit of why they would want to make the commitments that they do to us. And so we obviously pursue the sort of partnering principles that you would expect in that sort of relationship. This is our Swanwick Centre, which is the biggest centre in Europe, and that was kitted out by Lockheed, all of the systems in there. Now, that was an acquisition contract that actually was an adversarial contract, and it didn't go that well, and it was delayed 6 years. And if we'd have been doing it today, we wouldn't have done it like that. The system we put in at Prestwick was a collaborative contract. It was put in on time. It wasn't with Lockheed, but that wasn't because they couldn't do it. We'd come up with a different solution for Prestwick. The two different centres require different resilience and technology. But the crucial thing is, we could have moved on from Lockheed any time we'd wanted to. We've got 1,000 engineers in NATS. We could do it differently, but actually their capability and the way we work has meant that we've stayed with Lockheed, and so we're getting value out of that relationship. It isn't just about cost. So I wanted to just give you an example because I'm sure you're thinking, well, yeah, it all sounds nice, but what happens if it goes wrong? So this is what happens when it goes wrong. This year, in July, at around 10 o'clock, one of our major systems had a software fault. Now, if you don't know anything about software, and there's millions of lines of code in these systems, you can't detect everything at testing. We only put systems into service that have been rigorously tested. But there's always the odd latent defect, and there was one in this system. And by the way, it was a system that we designed that Lockheed and another supplier built for us. So there's no finger pointing. There's a lot of collaboration in the development of the system. So what happened was our architects, Lockheed architects and their software team worked with our engineers to try and analyse the cause of the problem. And very quickly we were able to identify that and ensure that the operation was affected to a minimal level. The important thing about that is it's probably not a safety risk at this stage because we've got a lot of fallbacks, but the crucial thing is we have penalties with the airlines. If we start disrupting their services, they start hitting us quite hard. So there is the investment in this way of working is crucial to ensuring that our business model is secured. So by the next day, in fact within 24 hours, the root cause of the failure had been analysed, a temporary and permanent measure, so the guys would do a patch, and then they would think about how you would then put in place a more long-standing way of dealing with the problem. And the effect there was that both of the teams worked together, whatever it took. We don't pay them extra for that. Those guys turn up, it's part of the commitment. That's the operation, by the way. That's the Swanwick Operations Centre. And the way we work with Lockheed is in that seamless way, and it's predetermined that whatever happens, whatever the problem, they will help us solve it. And so for us, that is collaboration in action. And I think I'm back over to Dave.
Thanks. I'm really glad they do it. How many of you have flown in the last month? Talk to this guy afterwards, I tell you. You may never fly again. Okay, thanks very much for that. But I think it's useful just to look at, I know it's not stretched across the globe, but it has a global impact. So, BS 11,000, what is it you're all asking? Aren't you? No. Okay. This was a model that we put together to understand why relationships didn't work. And as I said earlier on, our normal reaction to this, to a relationship problem with an organisation, we'll change contracts, we'll sue them, we'll re-engineer. If we're feeling really gracious, we might get a team together and work through the problem. But usually we hand it over to the lawyers. What we did was to look at what organisations do and why their relationships don't work. And we came up with this 8-step model. The first one, awareness, understanding your objectives. It came out this morning about objectives. What is it we're trying to achieve? Developing the way forward. The thing I'm concerned about in some of the conversations I've had today is that we talk about business continuity reactively. We should be talking about it when we're putting programs together. We should be asking ourselves those questions up front. What if? And in fact, you find it quite interesting. Under the knowledge section, one of the key clauses in there is what's the exit strategy? What happens when it starts to go wrong before you've even decided what suppliers you want to talk to. Start to think up front. Internal assessment. We're really good at telling other organisations how to behave. We're not particularly good at looking at ourselves to see how well we behave. Then it's about picking the right partners. If we go to Bangladesh to save 2 pennies and we don't care where we buy it, then expect to get a problem. It's going to happen. So finding the right partner. Working together is about establishing the governance. It's no good just having the CEO's phone number when it goes wrong. The organisations that are now integrated together in many respects, part of the delivery process, need to be working effectively all the time, not just when it goes wrong. Creating value. As Adrian said, they work together all the time with Lockheed Martin, looking at different ways, new ways of doing things, how to improve things. And part of that is about making sure that the process remains safe, resilient, reliable, and delivers. Staying together, team management, monitoring, measuring processes, understanding what's going on, and in particular, measuring behaviours. It's those behaviours that will drop us in it. And finally, the exit strategy. Markets change, pressures change. What do we do at the end when we finish a stage of a relationship? One of the things we found in our research was actually that the more you define the exit strategy, the better engagement you get with the organisation, because people understand the rules of disengagement. They also understand the triggers. So when they don't perform, they're not surprised. Some key milestones for us. Start back in '98, the first partnering guidelines for the MOD, Craft, PAS 11,000, the partnering handbook, BS 11,000, the Part 2 guide, which I actually think is more interesting than the standard itself because it's got some guidance in there on how to do things. The latest one for us was actually last year, where the Department of Defence have adopted BS 11,000 in their public-private partnership guidelines, which again is another first because we think it's the first time since 1776 that the US government has issued a document referencing a British standard. So, quite interesting. And the next step was going on to ISO. But I guess going back to the journey, one of the things that I found, and I started to talk about collaboration, what does it mean, how do we do it, was the fact that when I started to look at it, and I was a buyer trained to kill, the only good supplier was a dead one, hanging from a lamppost, bleeding to death. Was it any surprise they weren't really interested in my problems? They were too busy minding their own. So I went into the marketplace looking at what guidance was there. And there was a myriad of guidance. Consultants, academics, all sorts of gurus around there. Problem was, anybody remember Morecambe and Wise? They were all singing the same notes, but not necessarily in the same order. So they couldn't communicate with each other. Everybody was doing something slightly different. So BS 11,000, not a plaque on the wall, but a different way of doing business. What are the benefits? Adrian mentioned it. A common language, public-private sector, consistency. We talked about that earlier on when we were talking about the model. You know, I don't care what model you use, but use a model and use it consistently so you know what you're updating. If you continually start with a blank sheet of paper, you're always going to get it wrong. Risk management. I mentioned it earlier on. The biggest risk to most of your businesses is not the earthquake, although that will happen on occasions. The biggest risk is that the relationships you have with your key suppliers, with your supply chain, with your customers, your partners, breaks down. When that cracks, you have a problem if your processes are not yours, but they're shared across the supply chain. So building sustainable, mutual benefit relationships. Getting organisations to ask themselves and their partners the questions historically we haven't asked. Because we were in negotiations, it was all clever stuff. Hide it away, don't only tell them what they need to know. So, just for an update, here's some of the organisations that have already taken BS 11,000 into their organisations. And there's probably about another 100 that we're currently aware of that are going down the route. So for me, for today, sustainable relationships. Clearly the key to supply chain resilience, and for that matter business continuity, is clarity of potential impacts and risks. Seeking to simplify the visibility of contractual commitments around these issues is likely to leave aspects to assumptions which are perhaps even bigger risks. Developing the right kind of collaborative relationship with suppliers not only will help to broaden the perspective of risk, but in many cases, through greater openness, likely bring about wider and more effective solutions. Not only increasing openness, but also building trust and commitment to jointly work together when challenges arise. In its traditional context, business continuity has been focused on the implications for the business operations from an internal perspective, seeking to underpin its direct ability to respond to events. It is self-evident that as supply chains become more diverse, so the implications of these networks increases and broadens the horizons in terms of business risk and resilience. To enable this sea change of thinking, we need to take a step back, look at our activities to recognise where they have evolved to, and to some degree of risk that has, by default or good intent, built up across these operations. So finally, the Chinese proverb says, the longest journey begins with the first step. The next step will move collaborative working onto the international stage and position structured collaboration as a key ingredient for future organisational development, economic benefit and success. If you're interested in it, there's a BSI stand out there, go talk to them. So the journey for ISO 11,000 starts next year. The UK, BSI, ICW leading the way. Thank you.
Well, everybody, I don't know about you, but I was absolutely blown away by that presentation. Really opened my eyes to a lot of stuff, and I'm quite sure there's a lot of information there, a lot of messages, parity that you guys as delegates can relate to. Certainly one thing that I remembered was a talk by a chap called Assistant Chief Constable Graham Sutherland. Don't know if anyone out there has also heard of him. But he was the guy that managed the Carlisle floods a few years ago. His opening gambit was the rendezvous point for the boats is Debenhams. So that was the scale of the disaster that they were dealing with. And his underlying theme was they didn't get through that because of good planning or they had brilliant plans and lots of resources. They got through it because they'd spent an awful lot of time together beforehand, working collaboratively in this brand new approach called integrated emergency management, which I'm sure you've also heard of. So I know it does work. I've heard it firsthand from one of the guys that's had to do it. So if you could, has anyone got any questions or comments for these guys, please? Okay, I have one question, which is, are you going to go to perhaps somewhere like the Law Society and do this? Because it's always, for me, it's the lawyers that get in the way of this stuff. Yeah, corporate lawyers. Okay. So, guys, could you just show your appreciation for David and Adrian? Thank you.